flavors is really kind of like how you would like judge a beer.
Okay.
Because malt is used in the beer production of beer as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not uncommon for a distiller to use the same types of barley, malted barleys,
Mm-hmm.
as you would use in the whiskey making process. So a lighter.
And is there different varying degrees of how much you can malt the barley to? Or is
Yes.
Okay, so it's not just it's malted or not malted. If it's malted, it could be lightly malted or
Right.
very
Yeah,
heavily malted.
Heavily malted, and
Okay.
it could be dark. You could have a chocolate malted barley, which
Mm-hmm.
is it spends more time in the kiln, the drying process, and when they roast it, you know what I mean, they give it that nice deep brown hue, which starts to take on more heavy caramel,
Okay.
and coffee notes and chocolate notes.
So is this is that ingredient? If we talk about barley, corn, and rye, it's not. I mean, it's from my understanding, it's not like there's varying degrees. It's not like you're doing anything to the corn. It's not like there's different types of corn for the most part. But as we're talking about with the barley, so is the decision of where you get the barley from, the type, and what you do to it, does that have a bigger degree of how it can affect the product more so than like just the corn and just the rye? Obviously, I know the percentages are going to have.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, there's more to the barley, than there is the corn. There are, a lot of different strains of corn as well.
Okay.
Some containing more residual sugars. Within that,
you go to the
within
local
that
stand. I
corn
want
as well.
the sugary corn or the sweet corn
Yeah,
or whatever.
exactly.
Okay.
There's bloody butcher corn. There's blue corn. There's white corn, yellow corn.
Yeah.
Some are more dense than others, so you have to cook them longer to get the sugars out of that corn.
Yeah.
So there's flaked corn. So after the corn is basically boiled, what they do is the corn is superheated and basically put through like a steamroller, and they flatten it out.
Uh-huh.
And it brings the sugar already to the top of the flake.
And this is before it would be added in with the barley and the
Right.
rice.
Then
So
they
there
put-
is things that can be done to the corn to change it. Wow. Okay. Interesting. And then now, is there anything like this with the rye, or is the rye finally the simple one, or is
Rye
it,
is
or
the
is
same.
it,
Rye
or
is
is
the
it
same
just as
thing. You
complex
can
as
get
well?
you can get rye with the full husk on it.
Mm-hmm.
Cracked. Partially milled, finely milled. You can get flaked rye as well, just
Okay.
like you do flaked corn. Flaked rye is a little easier to work with, but it doesn't offer the full taste profile maybe that cracked milled rye would offer.
Okay. And so what I want to talk about next then is before we get into because I'm fascinated now. This is all stuff I thought I knew a lot of things, and here we are talking about things I never knew had anything to do with all this. So what my question is, and then we'll get into this a little bit more. So I think for the most part, like when you look at, we'll pick some bourbon companies, Woodford Reserve, Wild Turkey, Maker's Mark. I think we can find out the answer probably. Every like recipes are guarded secrets for these places. I think what if you really looked into it, it's either readily available or you can find out probably pretty easily. What's probably available is at least finding out maybe the percentages. Like we use 60, because I think when you go on the tours, they tell you we use an 80% corn, a 10% rye, a 10% barley, or something like that. But what probably beyond that they're probably, I would assume, like, okay, so now you mentioned, but do we know what type of corn? Do we know what you did to the corn? Do we know where what type of barley, how it was malted? These are all the varying differentiations that are making one product different from the next. Then, huh?
Right. They're not going to give you specifics.
That's really is that essentially when you talk about recipe? I mean, it's your percentages of these grains, but then the recipe is what type of grain and what's being done to it. Is that essentially what the recipe is? When talking about recipe?
That's the mash bill is basically giving you the percentages.
Okay, right.
The actual recipe is really probably guarded by the distillery, and they're not going to tell you, like if they said, well, our recipe or our mash bill contains 20% rye. They're not going to tell you whether out of that 20% is it 10% flaked rye and then 10% malted rye, or is there 2% chocolate rye in there? They're not going to tell you that.
Okay. And I'm always a big stickler for terminology. So like when you say mash bill, essentially mash bill, the simplest way would be basically it's what grains make up the combination and the percentages essentially. So a mash bill would be like, okay, this company uses 60% corn, 30% rye or barley, 10% rye, whatever. I'm just throwing out numbers. Mm-hmm. That's the mash bill.
Right.
And the recipe would be then getting into the specifics of everything you just said.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I want to do with that is I want to throw this at you and see if you're able to answer from this perspective. Let's just say you're working at the distillery and you want to make 2 different products. So give me an idea of like product 1. What is one way that you could go with product in terms of the final product? Like, let's say you want to make something that's sweet versus you want to make something that's bitter, but maybe you could be more specific. But then guide us where as starting at the beginning, where you're beginning to make different decisions to get you to those 2 different goals. So first, you can talk about, okay, well, if I want to get more to the sweet, here's my mash bill in terms of what we talked about, the percentages. But let's get specific. Okay, with the rye, I'm probably doing this, or with the corn, I'm going to search this type of corn. Can you kind of give us 2 different examples of 2 different tastes that you're trying to achieve, and then what directions you would be going to achieve each, so we can learn about what doing this to the rye or this to the corn takes us in this direction, so forth. Does that make sense? What I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's kind of simple in that equation because most of your sugars are going to come from your corn.
Okay.
So, with that in mind, a lot of your sweeter bourbons, and I consider, brands like Jim Beam,
mm-hmm.
One of the sweeter bourbons,
okay.
as well as Wild Turkey,
mm-hmm.
Standard 80 proof Wild Turkey. They're a little bit on the sweeter side because of the corn that they use.
Okay.
And then some of that sweetness also comes from the barrel as well.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. There's still so much with that too.
But that's what I would do. I would first look at my corn, what type of corn that I was going to use, and what percentage of corn to make a sweeter whiskey.
Okay.
And then versus a spicier whiskey, I would back away from the corn. And use more rye.
I like, I like that little bit of spice.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying in terms of when people use the term spice, like something that comes out to like, Maker's 46, even though that actually just has all to do, I love the spice on it, but that's not even, it's the same recipe. It's just the wood that they throw in the end. So that's just spice coming from extra wood. Even.
Yeah, higher proof and barrel aging will also increase the spiciness of that whiskey as you boost. You'll start noticing as you start boosting proof.
Okay.
You'll take on more spice as well because it's becoming more undiluted.
Okay. Well, then let's look at it like this because I do want to try to get this out of you. So let's look at it a slightly different way. Let's go through. Let's just say we have barley. Okay, we're going to start with our barley. What are of all the decisions we can make? Give me 2 big decisions that we can choose from that give us 2 completely different results with the barley. The one, I don't know if it's just the biggest is malted versus unmalted, but what else? You said different processing of it. And
yeah,
things like that. But what are 2 examples, and what is it going to do for us in terms of end product by making those different decisions?
Well, you're going to make. First off, as we discussed, your choice of barley
mm-hmm.
Is certainly going to make a big impact. Where that barley was, whether it's smoked, smoked and peated.
Okay.
Is it did they
and does that really happen here? Are we smoking or peating barley at all in the US?
Not as far as I know. There could be little proprietary places that are doing that.
Yeah.
But mostly you would go to Scotland for that because they have the peat bogs over there.
Right.
And that's where a lot of that takes place. That infiltrates the water as well.
Okay. Yes.
And
especially on like the Isla where you get that salt.
Exactly. That salt permeates into the ground.
It's everything.
It affects the water, which in turn, affects
just the water.
Right.
Just the water alone is
the smoking. It affects the smoking and the peating of the malt.
Yep.
So there's so many variables, in taste, and a lot of it is regional.
Okay. Yeah. So, what would happen? Let's say. Are there whiskey? If I go into the state store right now, because in Pennsylvania that's what we have to do, and I buy one popular, is there going to be any popular brands that are using unmalted barley, do you think, or is it pretty standard to have the barley malted?
No, I mean it could vary just between.
So what is that going to give me a difference? What is going to begin to differentiate in the alcohol if it's malted barley or not malted barley?
The malted barley is what you're really looking for is the enzymatic or diastatic properties of the barley.
Okay.
So certain barleys, depending on how much they are malted and kiln dried, is going to determine how much enzymatic power that barley has.
So it might not necessarily be not necessarily like the taste, but just how that whole
those enzymes are what helps
everything
convert those sugars into alcohol.
Okay.
So the darker you really get in your malt, the less enzymatic properties that you have.
Okay.
Because it's spending way more time in the kiln and getting dried and getting that roasty dark color flavor. Now you'll get more flavor on that end, but less diastatic power, less enzymatic power.
There is going to be a taste difference between those. Okay, so let's move on to the corn. Give me two different decisions that we can make with corn and the two different outcomes that we're going to have with those two decisions.
Let's say you're going to use milled corn versus rolled corn.
Okay, and most of us, basically, if we lived in the 1700s, we should probably all know what that is. I know I've heard these terms before, and it's probably like social studies. It's been a while, so remind me what the difference is of that, of milled and rolled corn. What is the difference there?
Yeah, basically they're using super hot steam, with the kernel corn. Flattening, they soften it, and they flatten it, with superheated, temperature, in a big roller, basically. So they run the kernels through a roller, smashes them down, flattens them, and now they become a flake, almost like cornflakes.
Okay, and so that's rolled.
Yeah.
And what was the other milled?
Milled.
Okay, so what is that?
Basically, they take the dried kernel, and then they crack it, and it's like busted up, and you'll get pieces of the kernels and stuff like that. Makes it a little bit easier to cook. And get the sugars out. You can use whole kernel corn as well.
Okay. So let's say, let me get you maybe use two different extreme examples. Let's say we have rolled versus the whole or whatever. What is that going to do differently to the product between those two decisions?
Well, it makes the rolled corn, I will say, can tend to make a mash very sticky and gummy.
Okay.
If a little bit too much is used in that process, because it's already been, heated and pressed into that flake.
Yeah.
It's already going to take on water fairly quickly, like a sponge.
Okay.
So
here I'm trying to pull out of you, like, if I do this versus this, it's going to give me different tastes, and here you are enlightening me even further, like, beyond that, it's going to be harder for the guys at the
I really
work with.
I'll be honest with you. I mean, there's preferences between corns with some distillers, and I think it's more or less.
But it has an effect on the process as well, too. I think
it's
more goes into it.
I think it's more or less bragging rights.
Yeah.
And to make it more of a boutique sort of corn, like we use Bloody Butcher corn, we use blue corn, we use we use yellow corn, and supposedly these corns have different levels of sugar in them.
Okay.
It just said, like I said, some take more effort to bring those sugars out, and I understand that those sugars will remain in the finished product more so and more evidently, more prominently than some of the other corn sugars do.
So, but it can also be a logistical thing where some distiller might just look at it and be like, if we use this corn, it's going to take longer to cook, or it's going to be harder to cook versus if we use this corn, like, we're going to keep the process moving quicker.
And it's really by choice based on region. They want to make a very regional product,
or it's just cheaper to bring in the local corn versus shipping in from further away too. Can also, so there's a lot of decisions. Then finally, with the rye. So let's take two examples. What are two different decisions we can make with rye, and what are the effects that we would have with that?
Yeah, you can use a basic flaked rye, just like a flaked corn, which is very low key. It doesn't. It's not overbearing in its rye taste, but it does offer a subtle rye flavor without being too obtrusive. And then you can start getting into your whole rye, a milled rye, which is I prefer to use like a cracked rye, which is like the husks are already cracked, so you can get to the heart.
I see.
Of that rye.
Okay.
And really get the spiciness.
Yeah.
From that. So, yeah, you definitely want to use that if you're out for definitely a spice.